The night I left, it was raining, the sort of soft, insistent rain that feels less like weather and more like a reckoning. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, the suitcase open like a wound at my feet, half packed with the remnants of the life we had built, or rather, the one I had been allowed to exist in. "You're nobody without me," he said, leaning in the doorway, his voice sharp with the confidence of someone who'd rewritten history so many times he believed his own edits. I didn't respond. Not because I agreed, but because I knew anything I said would be twisted and thrown back at me like shards of a broken mirror. I had learned that silence was safer than truth with a man like Daniel. He'd built his success on charisma and connections, a former investment advisor turned real estate consultant with an impeccable wardrobe and a hollow core. When we met, I was finishing my MFA, hopeful and naive, creating art out of discarded materials in a studio apartment above a laundromat. He was magnetic, successful, and, at first, kind. He called me his muse, said he'd never seen anyone capture loneliness like I did on canvas. But slowly, what began as admiration turned to ownership. He started with suggestions: what to wear, how to speak at his networking events, how to talk about my art without making people uncomfortable. Then came the dismissals. My work was too niche, my efforts cute. When I sold my first piece to a local cafe, he laughed and said, "You should have gifted it. Exposure's worth more than your price tag." Still, I tried. I painted at night when he was too tired or too distracted to notice. I sold pieces online under a pseudonym, an identity born of necessity. I squirreled away every dollar, every kind comment from strangers who found meaning in the colors and chaos I offered. And when he found out, he tore the paintings off the walls and told me that no one would remember my name if it weren't attached to his. But I remembered who I was before him, before the silence, before the walking on eggshells, before I became invisible in my own home. So that night, I zipped up my suitcase. Inside were only essentials: paints, brushes, a few clothes, and a stack of sketches I refused to leave behind. I left the wedding ring on the nightstand. It felt like the final line in a poem I'd rewritten in my head 1,000 times. I didn't look back as the door clicked shut behind me. The months that followed were brutal in their loneliness, but glorious in their clarity. I slept on a friend's couch at first, Marisol, who'd never liked him and never pretended otherwise. She made space for me and, more importantly, gave me silence when I needed it and encouragement when I doubted myself. I painted. God, I painted. With a hunger I hadn't felt in years. The colors came back into my world. My brush found rhythm again. My fingers remembered their purpose. And I shared my work online under my real name this time, Isabelle Laurent. No more hiding. By spring, I'd sold enough to rent a small studio. By summer, my name was circulating in local galleries. I built something brick by brick, not out of vengeance, but liberation. Still, I won't lie, there was a part of me, a quiet ember deep in my chest, that longed for the day he'd see what I'd become without him. That day came a year later at the opening of my gallery. And oh, it was sweet. The gallery bore my name, Laurent Gallery, in tall serif letters etched onto brushed steel, elegant but unassuming, just like I wanted. I remember the way the glass doors shimmered under the streetlight that night, the way my hands trembled not with nerves, but with reverence as I unlocked them for the first time. It was as if I were opening more than a building. I was opening a new chapter carved entirely by my own hands. Inside, the walls were bathed in warm light, each piece hung with deliberate care. Every painting was a milestone, a memory stitched into color. One depicted a woman walking through a rainstorm, suitcase in hand. Another showed a pair of hands wrapped in gauze, fingers stained with paint. The centerpiece, titled Becoming, was abstract, but I knew what it held: a fractured heart stitched together with threads of gold and defiance. Guests began to arrive, some familiar faces from the art world, some strangers who'd followed my journey online. Marisol, in her flowing rust-orange dress, buzzed between groups like a proud older sister. She had been the first to tell me I was brilliant and the last to let me forget it. Then, in a moment that felt pulled from the final scene of a film, he walked in. Daniel. He didn't recognize me at first. I watched him from the mezzanine, half hidden by shadows, as he paused inside the entrance. His eyes scanned the room, calculating, always calculating. Dressed in his usual sharp suit, the same scent of expensive cologne still clinging to him, he looked exactly the same. But I felt nothing, not fear, not anger, just a strange, detached pity. He made his way to the front desk, where the check-in list waited beside a bowl of wine-dark orchids. He leaned in and said something to the assistant, who pointed upward, in my direction. I descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, heels echoing like a countdown. When I reached the landing, our eyes finally met. His were the same deep brown I once believed held the world. Now, they just looked tired. "Isabel," he said, the name hesitant on his tongue. "You look different." I smiled. "You haven't changed at all." He glanced around, false charm slipping into his features like a reflex. "Impressive place. Who's backing you?" "Me," I said simply. He let out a short laugh, like I'd made a joke. "No, seriously. I am. I built this with my own money. No loans, no partners. Just sales, grants, and a lot of hard nights." He faltered. It was subtle, a blink too long, a tightening at the jaw, but I saw it. The realization. The recognition. "You bought this place?" he asked. I nodded. "Last week, actually. Signed the deed. It used to be commercial office space, but the lease was up." I let the silence breathe between us before adding, "Your office is upstairs, isn't it?" His lips parted. No sound came out. "I'll be your new landlord," I said, with a calmness that even surprised me. "Don't worry, rent's fair. You'll find the terms in the envelope your assistant should have received this morning." For a moment, he looked like a man dropped into cold water, stunned, gasping, drowning. And I felt nothing but the cool breeze of closure. "I should mingle," I said, gesturing toward the crowd. "Enjoy the art. Or don't." And then I walked away. The rest of that night blurred into a kind of gentle euphoria, like floating, but grounded by the weight of years finally shed. Every compliment from a guest, every nod of appreciation as they stood before my work, felt like a quiet affirmation, "You were right to leave." But it wasn't the praise that stayed with me. It was the way people lingered. Some stood before becoming for minutes, tilting their heads, leaning forward as if the paint could whisper secrets. A woman in a navy pantsuit wiped away tears while staring at held a piece I'd painted after sleeping 3 nights on Marisol's couch, depicting 2 figures intertwined, one bleeding, the other bandaging. A man in his 60s told me it reminded him of losing his wife. He thanked me, touched my shoulder, and walked away without another word. That night was not about vengeance. It was about visibility. About finally being seen, not as someone's girlfriend or a shadow artist, but as a creator. A voice. A presence. Daniel stayed until the end. He hovered near the back, sipping wine with the restraint of someone who once indulged too freely. I never approached him again. I didn't need to. I had given him what he gave me for years: silence, absence, the absence of approval, of warmth. He left with a curt nod. No apology. No congratulations. Just the understanding that we no longer spoke the same language. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, my life began to stitch itself into something whole. The gallery was open 3 days a week and appointment only on others. I taught weekend workshops, painting for survivors, mostly women, some escaping marriages like the one I had barely survived. We didn't talk much in those sessions. We let color do the speaking. My name began to appear in places I never expected. A local arts magazine did a feature. A collector from New York asked to commission a piece. A former professor sent a message: "You were always more than we gave you credit for." But the thing that moved me most was a letter. It arrived folded neatly, handwritten in uneven lines. No return address. I recognized the script instantly. Isabel. I saw the article. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. You were right to leave. I couldn't see it then, but I see it now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know you were never nobody. You were everything. I was just too broken to hold it. I read it once, then again. Then I slid it into a drawer I never opened. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed him. Not because he wrote it, not because he regretted it. Forgiveness was mine to give, or not. What I gave myself instead was grace. The kind I'd long denied myself every time I doubted my choices. Every time I stared at a blank canvas and wondered if I was still just pretending. The gallery's success wasn't measured in sales, though those came. It wasn't in accolades or press, or even the satisfaction of watching Daniel squirm. No, it was in the stillness I now carried. The soft, sacred silence that had once been stolen from me now returned, mine alone. And in that silence, I painted. There was a time when I painted just to survive. In the quiet hours after Daniel's storms, when the world shrank to the size of a bruised ego and a room full of broken promises, I'd reach for a brush not because I believed in beauty, but because I needed proof that something inside me still worked. Now, I painted for another reason, to testify. Each canvas was a chapter one hadn't yet spoken aloud. My hands remembered stories my mouth hadn't dared to tell, moments of humiliation, of erasure, of cold silences at crowded tables. And as the paint dried, it hardened into truth. No longer deniable. No longer hidden. In the months following the gallery's opening, I launched a series titled Unclaimed Histories. Each piece bore no names, only fragments of memory transmuted into shape and color. A woman holding a bouquet of keys. A house with no doors. A body made entirely of mirror shards, reflecting dozens of faces, none of which looked back. Women came. Some with scars visible, others with wounds stitched into their spines. They came not as collectors, but as witnesses. Many had never owned a single piece of art, let alone felt worthy of one. I told them that what hung on these walls was not made for boardrooms or penthouses. It was made for them, for every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too little, too difficult, too fragile, too angry, too loud, too invisible. They cried, and sometimes they bought. One day, a woman named Elise visited during the private hour I set aside each week. She was in her 60s, thin as reeds, her blouse pressed too precisely, as if armor could be ironed. She walked the gallery silently until she stood before Inheritance, a piece I had almost destroyed. It featured a woman made of broken windows, reaching toward a child who stood behind a curtain. Their faces were indistinct, but the ache between them was unmistakable. Elise said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, my mother told me I ruined her life when I was 12. I've never forgotten it. This feels like that moment. She didn't buy the piece, but she left with something heavier, acknowledgement, and perhaps the beginning of release. I closed the gallery early that night. I returned to my studio and began something new, something I hadn't yet dared, a self-portrait. Not of my face, but of my evolution. A suitcase sat at the center, tattered and humble. Around it, a growing garden, wild, untamed, unapologetically vibrant. Thorns curled lovingly around sun-drenched petals. In the background, a silhouette stood in a doorway, fading. Not absent, but no longer dominant. The piece wasn't finished, but I knew its name before the first brushstroke dried. She left and became. There is a peculiar kind of freedom in reclaiming your own name. For years, I had let mine be reduced. Isabel, the artist's girlfriend. Isabel, the charity case. Isabel, the one who got lucky. Even when I began to rise, the whispers followed me, sowing doubt into the hems of my ambition. But at the gallery, there was no prefix, no suffix, just Isabel Laurent, etched on the glass, printed on the invitations, whispered in admiration between strangers. A name worth carrying. One afternoon, I received a letter from a curator at the Modern Women's Collective. They'd seen my Unclaimed Histories series online and wanted to feature it in an upcoming exhibition, Women Who Walked Away. The title alone made me ache in places still tender. I said yes, of course. But afterward, I sat in my studio and cried, not because I was overwhelmed, though I was, but because this was the moment I had always dreamed of in the loneliest years. And no one from my past would understand how deeply it mattered. Especially not my parents. They had loved Daniel. Not because he was kind, but because he was successful. Charming in that surface-level way that played well at dinner parties. He used to buy them expensive wine and talk real estate as if he were a god. When I left him, their response was as cold as the granite countertops he'd once bragged about. "We just want you to be practical," my mother had said on the phone. My father's only comment? "You better hope he doesn't sue you for leaving the apartment early." I stopped calling after that. But now, on the cusp of this exhibition, I found myself longing not for their validation, but for the justice of being known. I wrote them a letter. It wasn't angry, just honest. I told them about the gallery, the exhibition, the years I had struggled alone. I told them about the art that bloomed from my wounds. I told them that I no longer needed them to understand, but I wanted them to know. I never sent it. Instead, I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of a frame that would hang at the exhibition, the things I couldn't say. Let the world read my truth in paint. My parents could remain characters in the shadows of the story they refused to witness. In the days leading up to the exhibition, I worked with fervor. I barely slept, but the exhaustion felt sacred like a devotion. I restretched canvases, adjusted lighting, wrote artist statements that bled vulnerability. Marisol brought me soup and scolded me for skipping meals. "You're not just surviving anymore, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "You're blooming." And for once, I believed her. I stood barefoot in my studio that night, surrounded by my own work, paint smudged on my arms, exhaustion in my bones, and I whispered aloud, "I am not nobody." The silence that followed felt like applause. Opening night of the Women Who Walked Away, exhibition shimmered like a dream crafted from ash and resurrection. The gallery space had been transformed into a cathedral of reclamation, walls heavy with history, ceilings echoing with the hum of survival set to light. I wore a deep indigo dress, simple but striking, the same color as the sky the night I left Daniel. It felt fitting, like carrying a piece of that final evening with me into this new world where I no longer needed escape routes. Only arrival. Marisol stood by my side, radiant and watchful as ever, her pride so evident it brought tears to my eyes. "Tonight, you're not just showing art," she whispered. "You're showing spine." I smiled through the tremble in my chest. The gallery doors opened and the crowd poured in, curators, critics, patrons, and survivors dressed in silks and scars. They walked slowly, reverently, from piece to piece. I watched their faces instead of the paintings. Watched them read into the brushwork what I had poured there, betrayal, rebirth, and the long ache of loneliness turned to gold. My section was toward the back, deliberately so. I didn't need the front. Let the noise happen near the entrance. I preferred the sacred quiet, the stillness where people stood longest. A woman in her 30s lingered in front of the things I couldn't say. Her lips moved silently as she read the artist's statement, which ended with, "Some stories are too tender for words." So I painted them instead. She turned to me, eyes glassy. "Thank you," she said. I nodded, unable to speak. Then, the unexpected. A voice behind me, familiar in its cadence but aged by guilt. "Isabel." I turned. It was my mother. She looked smaller than I remembered, like time and regret had deflated the posture of a woman who once stood so firmly behind appearances. Her pearl necklace sat askew, and her eyes were red, though her makeup hadn't run. Controlled, as always. but not composed. I read about the exhibition in the paper, she said. I didn't realize how much I didn't know. About you. There was a pause so long I felt the room disappear around us. I'm proud of you, she added. And that's when I knew healing was not always a grand gesture. Sometimes it was a trembled phrase spoken beneath the weight of years. A bridge extended, fragile and swaying, but possible. I'm not the same girl who left, I said. I can see that, she replied. She didn't have her name on gallery walls. I didn't embrace her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't turn away either. I let her exist beside me in that space of hard-earned light. And that, in itself, was enough. Later that night, after the crowds had thinned and the air was heavy with perfume and the sharp smell of wine, I stood alone before she left and became. The painting pulsed in the dim light, suitcase, garden, silhouette. My story, plain as breath. And beneath it, a small brass plaque. Artist, Isabelle Laurent. No footnotes. No apologies. No erasures. Just the truth, framed. In the days following the exhibition, something unexpected happened. I slowed down. Not from exhaustion, though that existed in every cell of my body, but from something deeper. A kind of settling, as if my spirit, once restless and raw, had found a chair in a sunlit room and finally, sat down. The media buzz came, as it always does when truth dares to speak beautifully. Interviews. Requests. Features in online magazines that once ignored my submissions. Words like emerging voice, defiant brush, and emotional resonance tumbled into headlines. But I didn't chase any of it. I let it come or go like weather. Instead, I focused on my sanctuary, the gallery, my studio, my Saturday workshops with women who brought their grief in mason jars and left with streaks of color on their arms. We didn't always speak of what hurt us. We didn't need to. Our hands did the telling. One Saturday, an older woman named Nora came in for the first time. She wore a scarf despite the summer heat and held her posture like someone who expected to be corrected. I handed her a brush and didn't ask why she was there. I had learned the power of letting people arrive on their own terms. She chose deep reds and greens, blending them into something that looked like bruises blooming into ivy. When she finished, she stared at it for a long time. I haven't painted since 1964, she said, voice soft. My husband said it was childish. I said nothing. She looked up at me, eyes glinting like steel softened by memory. He's gone now. And then she smiled. That day, I added another frame to the workshop wall. Not for me, but for her. For all of them. Small works from these women hung there like prayers made visible. Each piece unsigned, but none anonymous. Not anymore. I called it the Wall of Return. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A return. To self. To voice. To the rooms we were once told we didn't belong in. And slowly, my world expanded again. I began collaborating with other artists, women who had their own versions of Daniel, of erasure, of survival. We painted murals on the walls of forgotten buildings, turned alleys into altars. We told stories without asking permission. One afternoon, while painting the outline of a woman with outstretched arms on the side of an old factory, I got a call. It was from Daniel's assistant. Mr. Pierce would like to discuss a long-term lease extension, she said. He's impressed with the property's increased foot traffic and... I stopped her. Tell him the lease terms are posted. If he wants a discount, he can come to the next painting workshop. She stuttered. I smiled. Sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply laughs. There's a journal I keep tucked away in a drawer at the gallery. I don't write in it often, only when I feel the need to reckon with the past in a language more private than paint. The spine is cracked, the pages soft with use, and across the front, in faint gold lettering, it reads, Ledger of Losses. It began as a place to write down everything Daniel took from me. My confidence. My laughter. My sense of safety in a room with a closed door. The friendships I let fade because he said they were a distraction. The dresses I stopped wearing because he said they were too loud. The paintings I burned after he scoffed at them, calling them emotional clutter. But over time, the entries changed. I stopped writing what was taken. I started writing what I reclaimed. My first night alone in the studio, when I painted until dawn and cried, not from sorrow, but from the thrill of being free. The day I bought my own business cards, printed with Isabelle Laurent, owner and curator. The time I paid my rent with nothing but money earned from my art. The moment I walked into a bank and handed over a check, not borrowed, not co-signed, but mine for the down payment on the gallery. Each entry became a thread, woven from grief, but sturdy with triumph. That journal lives in my drawer not as a relic of pain, but as proof that the woman I am now is not just someone who survived. She is someone who rose. One afternoon, Marisol and I went out for coffee, a rare luxury amid our chaotic schedules. We sat beneath the awning of a little cafe 2 blocks from the gallery, the air thick with the smell of espresso and late summer jasmine. You know, she said, stirring her iced latte, he still talks about you. I raised an eyebrow. Daniel, she clarified. I overheard him at the bank. Said you were lucky the gallery caught on. That you wouldn't be where you're if not for the exposure he gave you. I didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Because here's what I've learned. Men like him don't believe in reinvention unless they control it. To them, your growth must always be tied to their soil. If you flourish elsewhere, it threatens the illusion they built. He's right, I said slowly. If he hadn't underestimated me, I might never have known what I was capable of. Marisol smiled, proud. That's a dangerous thing, you know. What is? A woman who doesn't need a mirror to know her worth. We toasted with our plastic cups. Hers clinked lightly against mine, and in that soft sound, I heard every voice that had tried to hush me. They had failed. There's a secret no one tells you about starting over. At first, you run. Fast and far. You slam doors behind you, pack light, sleep in borrowed rooms, and speak only when spoken to. Starting over feels like fleeing. Like building something in the dark and praying the dawn will find you. But staying, that's the real art. It takes more courage to stay in a space you've carved with your bare hands than it ever did to leave the ones that bruised you. Staying means tending to what you've planted, watering it daily, protecting it from doubt and frost. I learned that lesson on an unremarkable Wednesday. The gallery was quiet. The kind of lull between exhibits where the walls echo too much and the air smells of drying paint and possibility. I was preparing for my next series, Rooms I Couldn't Enter, inspired by the spaces women are told they don't belong, boardrooms, pulpits, dining tables where decisions are made. I was mid-sketch when the power flickered, and then went out. I froze for a breath. Old panic stirred. A conditioned response. Darkness had once meant danger, a precursor to yelling, to doors slamming, to words sharpened like knives. But then I lit a candle and waited. In the warm flicker of the flame, surrounded by blank canvases and possibility, I felt it. Safety. Not the illusion I used to cling to, the kind where silence was confused for peace. No, this was the kind born of sovereignty. The kind that comes when you realize that no one holds the keys to your sanctuary but you. The lights returned within minutes, but I left the candle burning. That night, I stayed at the gallery late, sleeping on the old velvet couch in the back office. I watched the city through the windows, the way headlights curved down the street like rivers of light, and I let the quiet settle into me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next morning, I began painting the first piece in the new series. It was a room without doors, but with one wall crumbled into wildflowers. A place where no permission was needed to enter, only truth. I named it Let Her In, because I had. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, not for danger, but for ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, no. These ghosts wore tailored suits and soft smiles. They lived in boardroom chairs, echoed in voicemail greetings, and clinked glasses at fundraisers while forgetting my name. They haunted me not because they hurt me, but because they never thought I'd make it without them. One such ghost arrived on a Tuesday, late afternoon, with a hesitant knock on the gallery's front door. I almost didn't recognize him. Julian Blake. Once Daniel's closest friend, and at one point, my so-called confidant. He had helped Daniel broker deals, plan investments, and occasionally played devil's advocate when things between Daniel and me began to fracture. "Isabel," he said, stepping inside as if the air itself startled him. I said nothing, just gestured toward the bench near the window. He sat, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blazer, still expensive, still trying too hard. "You've done well for yourself," he offered. "I have." He cleared his throat. "I came to apologize. That I didn't expect. For not standing up for you. For seeing it and staying silent." My eyes narrowed. "Which part did you see?" "The way he spoke to you. The way he dismissed your work. The control. We all saw it. We just thought it wasn't our place." "It was your place," I said, voice low. Silence was complicity. He flinched. I didn't soften the blow. Some ghosts needed to hear the sound of their own chains. "But you're right about one thing," I added. "I have done well. Without any of you. Without Daniel. Without the doubt you all wrapped in smiles and served like hors d'oeuvres at his parties." He nodded, shame heavy in the slump of his shoulders. "I didn't expect forgiveness," he said. "You won't get it," I replied, not unkindly. But then I offered him something better, closure. "You're welcome to stay for the new exhibit. You might learn something." He lingered for a moment, then rose and wandered the gallery in silence. I watched as he paused before she left and became. His brow furrowed, as if realizing for the first time the depth of what had been erased from his vision. He didn't speak again. When he left, the bell above the door chimed softly, and with it, another ghost departed. Not banished. Released. And me? I returned to my studio and opened a fresh canvas. Because the only guest I ever needed in that room was truth. I've learned that healing has an architecture. It doesn't look like what they show you in glossy self-help books or neat social media quotes. It's not a perfect arc of pain to break through to peace. No, it's more like a house built slowly, with trembling hands, using scraps no one else wanted. My gallery was that house. Each wall held memories hidden in the seams, plaster smoothed over by resilience, nails driven in by defiance. The lighting? Chosen not just to flatter the art, but to warm the people who stepped inside, still shaking from their own storms. And in that house, something strange began to happen. People stayed. Not just for exhibits or purchases, but for what the space became, a haven. An unofficial sanctuary for the unseen, the unheard, the women who walked in clutching stories like broken china and left with at least one piece mended. One of them was a girl named Samira. 17. Skittish. She came during one of our free community nights. Her jeans were ripped at the knees, her eyes lined with defiance and something more fragile beneath. She didn't speak much that first evening. Just stood near the refreshments, pretending to sip soda while watching everyone else paint. I saw her draw in the margins of a paper napkin, intricate lines, birds, a mouth with no face. The second time she came, she brought her own sketchbook. The third time, she stayed after everyone left. "You really own this place?" she asked, eyebrows lifted, voice laced with skepticism. "I do," I said. She stared at me, unsure whether to believe it. "How?" "By starting small," I said, "and not stopping." She didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. Weeks passed. Samira returned again and again. Her sketches became bolder. She began speaking during workshops. One day, she asked if she could help hang the next exhibit. That day, I gave her a key to the gallery. Not because she needed it, but because once upon a time, someone should have given one to me. By spring, she had a small display in the gallery's front window. 5 pieces. One of them titled "The Mouth You Gave Me." When I saw it, I had to sit down. Because that's what art is, isn't it? Not just expression, but inheritance. of courage, a voice of space. I told her that night, "You don't need anyone to tell you you're good enough. You already are." She looked at me with a kind of awe I wasn't used to, but it wasn't worship. It was recognition. We saw each other. Across years. Across stories. Across the rubble of what we'd both survived. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just my gallery anymore. It was a home for every woman learning how to stay. It came in a cream envelope with sharp corners and embossed gold lettering, his trademark flourish. Daniel had always believed that elegance was best served cold. The return address bore the name of his firm, now rebranded as Pierce and Valor. Inside was a letter 4 paragraphs long. Formal, detached, and laced with the kind of veiled condescension I remembered all too well. He was contemplating an early lease renewal, he wrote, provided that terms remained favorable. He went on to compliment the refreshed branding of the gallery space and suggested that cross-promotional opportunities might benefit both our ventures. And then, at the very end, the line that turned the knife. "It's gratifying to see you've found some success. I always believed you had potential, if guided correctly." I laughed. Out loud. Alone in the back office. It wasn't the mocking kind of laughter. It was the sound of old chains rattling for the last time before they turned to dust. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a drawer, the same one that held the ledger of losses. I didn't reply. Instead, I drafted a new clause into his lease agreement. No branding collaborations. No co-sponsored events. And a strict policy against hosting clients in the common areas during gallery hours. He signed it 2 days later without comment. And I felt nothing but peace. That's the quiet revolution of healing, when you no longer need to win, only to live unshaken. When your boundaries are no longer barbed wire, but garden gates, firm, beautiful, and entirely yours to open or close. A week later, I received a handwritten note in a brown envelope with no return address. Inside, a short message. "Saw your work in Boston Monthly. You made it. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you." No signature. But I knew the handwriting. My father's. It landed softer than I expected, like a stone placed gently instead of thrown. I didn't respond to him either. Not out of cruelty, but because there are silences that speak louder than forgiveness. Silences that say, "I see who you were." And I chose not to follow. That night, I painted something I'd been avoiding for months. A girl curled in a corner, surrounded by voices painted in abstract strokes. Gray, crimson, navy. Over time, she rises, not with fists but with open arms, carrying pieces of herself stitched back together in gold. I called it Inheritance Denied, because sometimes what we lose from our families is exactly what frees us. There's a particular sound I've come to know well, the creak of the gallery floorboards late at night, when all the guests are gone and only the paintings remain. Each step carries its own echo, like the building itself remembers who once stood where, who whispered what truths or untruths beneath its old beams. It feels like walking through history, through lives layered one over the other like brushstrokes that refuse to dry. One evening, long after closing, I stayed to finish a series for an upcoming exhibit. The gallery had grown quiet, wrapped in the soft hum of city twilight outside. I was rearranging the lighting, a task I reserved for solitude, when I heard it, those familiar creaks near the back. Not footsteps, just the memory of them. That corner of the gallery used to be Daniel's office. Before I bought the building. Before I transformed it. Now it housed room without approval, a piece I hadn't yet spoken publicly about. A dimly lit space painted in deep, bleeding shadows. The only illumination came from a single door left ajar, golden light spilling across the floor like truth that refused to stay hidden. It was the most emotionally expensive painting I had ever made, and it was the one that visitors rarely lingered before. Some said it made them uncomfortable. Others said they didn't get it. But every now and then, someone, usually a woman in her 40s or older, would stop, stand, and exhale like the weight on the canvas matched the one on her back. That night, I stood in front of it myself, arms crossed, trying to understand what it still demanded from me. Because something inside me hadn't closed. Not a wound. A door. I realized I had left Daniel's story behind. Yes. But mine? Mine still clung to the corners. The echo of years spent dimming my light so he wouldn't feel small. The silence I practiced until it became my second language. The way I still, sometimes, waited for praise that wasn't coming. I pressed my palm to the cool wall beside the painting. I release you, I whispered. Not to Daniel. To the version of myself that waited in rooms for permission to matter. I walked back to the office, lit a candle, and opened the ledger of losses. And I wrote. June 7th, I stopped needing them to see me. I saw myself instead. That night, I didn't lock the gallery door when I left. I let it stand open for a few minutes as I watched the streetlights shimmer off the glass. Because the world I had once hidden from was finally safe to step into. It had been nearly 18 months since I walked out with a single suitcase. Since I took that first breath of unfamiliar freedom and dared to trust it wouldn't collapse beneath me. 18 months of rebuilding, repainting, and learning the art of being alone without being lonely. And then, one afternoon, they came. My sister Claire and my mother. Unannounced. Arms folded and mouths pursed as if the very air inside the gallery was difficult to breathe. I saw them through the glass before they entered. My mother wore her familiar shade of disappointment like a scarf, elegant, suffocating. Claire had that look in her eyes again, the mix of curiosity and judgment she perfected in our teenage years, especially when Daniel used to bring us to family dinners like trophies, me a glass doll and him the master of ceremonies. They stepped inside slowly, as though entering sacred ground. Isabel, my mother said, not quite smiling. It's lovely. Claire walked ahead, her heels clicking against the floor, arms swinging with performative nonchalance. I saw the article in Art and Vision. You're getting attention now. Was that a compliment or a warning? I asked, tilting my head. She didn't answer. She never did when truth caught her off guard. They wandered the gallery in silence for several minutes, the weight of our history trailing them like smoke. When they stopped in front of She Left and Became, I stepped beside them. My mother's voice trembled slightly. Is that about you? Yes. Claire turned to me. You were always dramatic. No, I said calmly. I was always dismissed. There's a difference. And for once, no one rushed to correct me. They stayed another 10 minutes. Not quite long enough to understand, but long enough to realize that they didn't recognize this version of me. The one who had stopped performing. The one who no longer asked for validation that was never freely given. As they turned to leave, my mother hesitated. I never wanted you to feel unseen. I know, I replied, but that didn't stop it from happening. She nodded. A small, almost imperceptible motion. But in our family, it was a tidal wave. They left without fanfare. No embrace. No apology. But something had shifted. The air wasn't heavy anymore. I returned to my office, closed the door, and opened the ledger. August 4th, they finally saw the gallery. I think, maybe, they also saw me. That night, I didn't cry. I painted. Because every time the past tried to walk through that door, I wanted it to find me doing what I was born to do. There's an old belief in Eastern traditions that we are all connected by invisible red threads, ties that stretch across time and space, binding us to the people we are meant to meet, meant to lose, meant to remember. Sometimes, I wonder how many threads were cut so I could stand where I do now. The day after my mother and sister left the gallery, I received a small, square envelope, cream-colored, elegant handwriting, no return address. For a moment, I braced myself. Another apology? Another belated compliment shrouded in control? But inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, just a sketch. A woman standing at the edge of a cliff, holding a paintbrush like a sword, facing a sky that had been shattered and stitched back together with red thread. I turned it over. A name in the corner, Samira. And underneath it, in pencil so faint I almost missed it, "You gave me a new thread." I held the drawing like scripture. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that we don't always get to see the full impact of our becoming. That our survival is not just our own, it echoes. It teaches. It gives permission. I decided that night to begin a new project. Not a series of paintings, but a collaboration. I reached out to every woman who had participated in our workshops, our exhibits, our late-night quiet conversations in the gallery's back room. I asked them to send me something, anything, that represented their journey. A photo, a poem, a scrap of fabric, a piece of music, a pressed flower. I called it the Thread Archive. It wasn't about showcasing trauma. It was about honoring what we had chosen to weave from it. Within weeks, submissions poured in. A burned journal page with a single line intact. "I said no, and it still matters." A fragment of a wedding veil dyed in indigo, sent by a woman who left her husband after 20 years of silence. A small wooden carving of a bird, made by a woman who found her voice again at 63. None of the entries bore names. That was the rule. Because sometimes, liberation means not being claimed. Sometimes, it means being untraceable except by the echoes of who you once were. The first night I installed the archive, I left the gallery unlocked. I sat behind the front desk with the lights dimmed and a sign on the door, "If you need a place to breathe, come in." 3 women arrived. None of them spoke. They stayed for almost an hour, reading, touching, crying quietly in corners. When they left, one of them paused at the door, looking back at me. "Thank you," she whispered. And I knew what she meant. Not thank you for the art. Thank you for the thread. It was around the holidays when the invitation came. Handwritten, heavy cardstock, embossed with gold leaves and soft calligraphy. "You are warmly invited to the annual Pierce and Partners Winter Gala." I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I already did. This wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. One Daniel had likely orchestrated to either reclaim the narrative or prove to the world that there were no hard feelings. It was a test. An invitation wrapped around a dare. He had included a note inside. "Hope you'll join. Many people would love to see the woman behind the gallery. Let's show them how far we've both come." There it was again, his favorite game. Disguising manipulation as magnanimity. I didn't reply, but I made a decision. That night, instead of attending the gala, I hosted a gathering of my own. Quiet, candlelit, held in the studio space behind the gallery, where every wall carried the fingerprints of women who had learned to speak through paint and clay and fire. We called it Uninvited. Each guest brought something, a dish, a poem, a memory, a wound. We sat on the floor in a circle, plates balanced on knees, stories passed like bread. Marisol read a letter she'd written to her younger self. Samira shared her newest piece, a collage of eyes, all open, none apologizing. I sang, softly and not well, but enough. We laughed. We cried. We stayed too late and didn't care. There was no press. No photographers. No white tablecloths or clinking of champagne flutes. Just the sound of healing being shared without performance. Later, as I washed dishes in the gallery's tiny kitchenette, I imagined Daniel at his gala. Surrounded by hollow pleasantries, smiles stretched thin over ambition, telling stories that began and ended with his name. He might have looked around the room that night and thought he owned it. And maybe he did. But I didn't want rooms I had to conquer. I wanted ones I could fill. That night, I opened the ledger and wrote, December 14th, I missed nothing. And I lost nothing. In fact, I have never felt more full. I tucked the invitation into the back of the book, not as a souvenir. As a reminder that not every door you're invited to is one you need to walk through. The gallery's 3rd annual spring showcase was approaching, and this time, I felt ready for something I'd always avoided, a formal guest list. Until now, every exhibit had been open to all, public and democratic, with no velvet ropes or RSVP-only pretense. That had been intentional. A way to undo what Daniel once built, those rooms where only names with power or pedigree were granted entry. But this show, titled Rooms Reclaimed, was different. It featured pieces from survivors, not just mine, but from collaborators across the country. Women who had once sat in silence, now sending me canvases, sculptures, even audio recordings layered with truth. This exhibit deserved care, curation, presence. So I drafted a list. Friends, mentors, artists, writers, women who had stood in fire and come out gold-veined. And then, at the very end, I wrote a name I hadn't expected to: Regina Alcott, my old art professor. The woman who once told me my work was too emotional to be taken seriously in academic galleries. I remember that day vividly. I had submitted a series titled Domestic Tension, painted during the most volatile year of my relationship with Daniel. She had looked at the collection and said, "These pieces are powerful, but they feel messy. Perhaps you should aim for something more refined next time." I'd nodded, then taken the long way home, stopping in a park to cry beneath a willow tree. What she didn't know was that those paintings had saved me from spiraling into despair. And yet, years later, here I was, writing her name on an invitation list, not out of forgiveness, but evolution. I wanted her to see what Too Emotional had become. Opening night arrived. The gallery pulsed with warm light, voices soft and reverent as people wandered through rooms draped in stories. One wall was covered entirely in anonymous letters submitted by survivors. Another featured a digital loop of hands painting, breaking, mending. And in the corner, her noise, a sculpture made from broken violins, tangled wire, and bits of shattered mirror. Regina came. She stood before one of my new paintings, Boardroom Without Chairs, a stark depiction of a room filled with women standing while empty suits hung on hooks like decorations. She didn't speak to me, but she stayed a long time. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the guest book and wrote something. After the gallery emptied, I read her note. Messy never looked so sacred. Thank you for staying loud. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened. Not for her. For the version of myself who once needed her approval. That girl didn't exist anymore. Now I made my own rubrics. And the only metric that mattered was this. Does it tell the truth? If yes, then it belonged. There's a specific kind of light that enters a room when winter dies. It's not just brighter, it's bolder. Less filtered, more honest. It falls through the gallery's tall front windows and lands in long rectangles across the wooden floors, the way a confession might land between two people after years of polite avoidance. It was under that light that I met Mira. She arrived one morning in March, shoulders tense, fingers stained with charcoal, asking if there were any open residencies. I had seen her name once, small, tucked into the back pages of a local art scene. Her work was raw, unafraid. And behind her eyes, I saw a familiar storm. "I don't have a formal application," she said, voice low, "but I brought my portfolio." I glanced through it, bold lines, fragmented figures, colors like bruises refusing to fade. "You don't need a formal application," I told her. "You just need a key." She blinked, stunned. Seriously? Seriously. That's the thing about surviving something. You learn to recognize the ones who haven't yet crossed the finish line. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can offer them is now. Not someday. Mira moved into the back studio 2 days later. She worked in silence, often barefoot, often with music that vibrated the floor, cellos, mostly. She painted with the fury of someone chasing herself through a maze. And then one night, she knocked on my door. "I need help," she said. She stood there trembling, holding a canvas so wet the paint dripped onto the hallway tile. It was a self-portrait, or at least I think it was. Her face was only half-rendered, the other side covered in shattered glass glued directly onto the canvas. "I can't finish it," she whispered. So I sat with her. We didn't talk. We just breathed. And eventually, she picked up her brush and began again. That was the first time I witnessed healing happen in real time. Not as a concept, not as a retrospective, but as a moment lived. A woman rebuilding her own reflection in front of my eyes. Weeks later, Mira held her first solo showcase in the gallery's side room. We called it Shards and Saints. The night it opened, she stood before a crowd of strangers and read from her journal a passage about the moment she realized survival wasn't the end of the story. That choosing to stay, to make, to share was a second kind of rebirth. And as I watched her speak, I realized something else. This gallery had become more than a gallery. It was a womb, a forge, a haven for rebirths that didn't look like fairy tales. The kind where the princess rescues herself. A wall of mirrors, not for vanity, not for reflection, but for revelation. Each pane cracked differently, each one salvaged from discarded furniture, old salons, shattered bathrooms. I wanted to create a space where women could see themselves not through the lens of expectation, but through the reality of how they had survived. I called it the mirror wall. We installed it in the west wing of the gallery, where the light changed most throughout the day. By morning, it sparkled. By dusk, it darkened, the cracks more pronounced, shadows stretching between the glass. Every visitor who stepped into that space reacted differently. Some avoided eye contact, slipping past as if the wall demanded more truth than they were ready to give. Others stood for long minutes, tracing their own outlines in the breaks, finding pieces of themselves reflected not in smooth, perfect surfaces, but in the fragments. One woman, her name was Jules, wrote in the comment book, "I have never felt more seen than when I saw myself in what was broken." That wall became a confessional of sorts. Women began taping notes to it, post-its, scraps of journals, receipts with scribbled affirmations. He doesn't get to define my worth. I left. I'm still scared. But I left. My silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. We didn't remove the notes. We framed them. Soon, the mirror wall wasn't just an installation. It was a living archive of witness. Samira added a poem to the center pane, etched into a copper plate. She looked into the cracks and saw every woman who ever told the truth and was punished for it, and smiled, knowing she stood among them now. I remember sitting in front of that wall one night, after the gallery had closed, the room dark except for a single hanging bulb above. I watched my reflection multiply in those fractured panes. Not one version of me was whole, not one untouched. But together, they were radiant. And for the first time in my life, I didn't long for the girl I used to be. I honored her, but I didn't want to be her again. Because this version, this mosaic of grit and grace, was the masterpiece. And not even Daniel, not even my family, not even the coldest nights I spent alone in that tiny studio with empty cupboards and unfinished canvases, could claim credit for her. She was mine. All mine. It started as a dare to myself, one that made my hands shake as I prepared the canvas. A portrait series, but not of strangers. Not of abstract bodies in motion or symbolic silhouettes. This time, I would paint the women I knew. The ones who had rebuilt themselves right in front of me. And I would do it without asking permission, not out of arrogance, but because these portraits were not about approval. They were about truth. I called it Portraits Without Permission. Each subject was rendered in shades they never wore, postures they'd never seen themselves in. Samira's was a firestorm of reds and violet, her eyes defiant, her hand reaching outward instead of upward. Marisol's showed her midlaugh, surrounded by broken clocks. Time had never dictated her story. Myra's was the hardest. She had asked not to be painted. So I painted the moment after she said no. Her back turned, brush in hand, a mirror just beyond the frame, cracked, of course. The kind of painting that spoke louder than consent could ever contain. Because it wasn't about her image. It was about her choice. When I showed the first few pieces to the women they depicted, there were tears. And not all of them happy. "I don't look like that," Marisol said, voice soft. No, I replied. You look more. But this is how I see you. This is the woman who gave me soup when I had nothing. The woman who stood outside my first exhibit and told every stranger to go inside. She nodded, slowly, and then smiled. We hung the series in the East Wing. I didn't label them with names. Just a small brass plate beneath each one. Seen. The response was overwhelming. Women wrote letters, sent photos of themselves standing before the portraits, claiming them as reflections. Some asked if they could commission their own. Others simply thanked me for painting women with power in their posture, even when their stories were still raw. One afternoon, I found an envelope taped to the base of Myra's portrait. Inside was a note. Thank you for seeing me even when I couldn't bear to look. And signed. But I knew her hand. That evening, I wrote in my ledger. April 10th, I stopped waiting for permission. And what followed was sacred. The gallery had become a place where women weren't asked to smile or shrink or soften. They were allowed to exist. Fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And I painted. Not to prove anything, but to remember. To remember every version of me who once sat in silence, waiting for someone else to call her worthy.